In this video, I'll show you what I believe to be one of the most productive ways of developing web resources with Visual Studio 2017. Web resources are a feature of model-driven Power Apps using the Common Data Service. And if you're not familiar with that terminology, model-driven Power Apps are a new feature of Power Apps since the spring 2018 release, which is currently in public preview. For those of you who are familiar with Dynamics 365 and the platform often referred to as XRM, this Power Apps release brings the extensibility platform in Dynamics 365 into Power Apps through model-driven Power Apps and the Common Data Service. What that means is that Dynamics 365 applications are now built on top of Power Apps. So whether you're watching this video because you're new to model-driven Power Apps, or you've been developing and extending Dynamics 365 for some time now, the approach I show you will be the same for either scenario, because again, the platform that powers Dynamics 365 is now called Model-Driven Power Apps and the Common Data Service. One of the key productivity enablers inside of Visual Studio that works with Visual Studio 2017 is an extension called D365 Developer Extensions. So if you don't have this extension installed, make sure you install it if you plan on following along. There are a number of different community extensions out there for Visual Studio, but in my opinion, this is the most comprehensive add-in to Visual Studio for developer productivity. Depending on when you watch this video, there may be a new extension for Visual Studio from Microsoft. However, until there is, this is the extension I personally use, and you can be the judge as to whether it's an extension you want to use. All right, so after we've installed this extension, say File, New Project, and you'll see under D365 Devex, there are a number of extensions. And while I'm going to focus on web resources, there's a lot in here to help with source control using Solution Packager, building plugins, using TypeScript, creating a console application. You sort of get the idea and the pattern here. But we're going to start with web resources. Now, before we do that, I'm going to switch over here to Power Apps, and specifically the Admin Center. So I'm at admin.powerapps.com. And you'll notice that I have a few environments, but I've created one, dkdt-wr, for the purpose of this demonstration. And again, for those of you who are familiar with Dynamics 365, if you click on this environment, you'll notice that you can manage these settings from Dynamics 365 Admin Center. If I click on this, this is the trusty old Dynamics 365 Admin Center that you're probably familiar with. And this just further demonstrates that Power Apps, model-driven apps, and the Common Data Service specifically really is essentially a stripped down version of a Dynamics 365 instance without all of the first-party applications like sales, marketing, field service, project service, customer service, etc. installed. So for example, when you click open here, you'll notice that we still have some of the Dynamics 365 branding, and one can expect that this might change over time as this platform transitions from being Dynamics 365 branded to being Power Apps branded, and then evolved over time. So if I take this environment and I look at it in web.powerapps.com, you'll see there here's the same environment, dkdt-wr. You can see that I have a number of apps installed into this environment. Again, the term environment is relatively synonymous with Dynamics 365 instance. And again, since Power Apps is now the platform that Dynamics 365 is built on top of, it's also the platform that Dynamics 365 is extended through. Therefore, everything I'm showing you works not only for model-driven Power Apps, which use the Common Data Service, it also works for extending Dynamics 365 applications because they are model-driven Power Apps built on top of the Common Data Service. So for the purposes of this demo, I just want to show this very simple app. It's literally an app with a single navigation and a single entity. And the idea is that we want to wire up some JavaScript to this form, do it as productively as possible from Visual Studio, including deployment, debugging, etc. So let's take a look at how this app was built. Again, it's a relatively simple app. It just has an entity, an app, and a sitemap. And so what we want to do here is come over to the entity form and wire up some JavaScript. But of course, we see that we don't have any JavaScript deployed into this solution yet. Let's go ahead and grab this, get it out of the pop-up window, put it over here. All right, so let's get started. Let's go back over to Visual Studio. We'll select the web resource project type. I'm just going to call this WR demo. You notice that the project type gives us some starter folders for CSS, images, and JavaScript. I'm going to add a JavaScript file, and we'll just call this WR demo form.js. We'll create a function. I'll just call this dkdt underscore form load. This. So next thing you want to do is right click on the solution, and after you've installed this extension, you'll get this option D365 Developer Extensions Web Resource Deployer. All right, notice that I have the project selected here. If I then connect, you don't want to auto login. I'll connect using my credentials. Make sure you're pointing to the right online region. Notice it's retrieving solutions. Depending on your environment, you may have gotten a list of options to connect to, but in my environment, I only have one common data service database provisioned, so it only recognized one and auto-loaded that. If you have multiple Dynamics 365 instances or common data service environments with databases provisioned in them, then you would have gotten the option to choose. Again, notice that the project that this is mapped to is this project right here. And then I'm going to pick my solution, which represents this right here. All right, the same word there, right there. Notice that I've got no web resources, so I want to create a new one. In this solution, I'm going to create, based on this file right here, using the same naming convention and folder structure up on the server, and it's of type JavaScript. So the tool is smart enough to default general patterns that most Dynamics 365 and now common data service developers will use for creating and naming web resources. So I'll go ahead and click Create here. And since this is the initial creation, if we come back over, we'll see that that web resource is there. Now that's great, but not everybody starts from scratch, right? So what if you already had a web resource in here? So I'll create a new web resource, or let's say you had tons of web resources in here. Just to kind of show how you can handle that scenario, we'll come in here, select web resource. Now I'll just create an HTML web resource. And we'll call this /sum.html and use the same kind of naming convention here. In this case, we'll make it a web page, and I'll just to kind of prove that from the server, prove that we can pull this down into our Visual Studio project. So we'll save this, close it, publish all our customizations. Now if we come back to Visual Studio and we refresh here, what you're supposed to see here is just the web resources in this solution. I think this might be a bug in the extension because I think I've run into this before. So I'm just going to close the solution and reopen it. And then we'll come over here Go to the web resource deployer. Let's connect again. All right, this time we'll switch to this solution and refresh. And I can pull down some.html. So I can click this button and say download. So if I do that, notice that it just showed up in Solution Explorer here. Notice this spkl.json. This is a configuration file that saves a lot of what you do in the GUI here and maps different aspects of what's being done locally up into the server. And in our case, we're only doing web resources for this project. So I'm going to go through here and delete some of this stuff just to clean it up. So I can then come over here and I can change this to client. Can change this to updates just to kind of prove that we've got some changes. So I can come back over here and I can select these items. Again, notice that the local file that it's mapped to, this is what it's called up on the server. So display name, its name, local file that it's mapped to. So you can always change this if you got something wrong. And I can publish both of these. I can publish things individually, etc. So I just click publish. It's going to take my local changes and push it up to the server. So again, just to kind of prove that, if I come over here, we just click the text editor, we can see that the changes have been published. And of course, the same thing would be true of the HTML here. There it is. All right, so we've got a nice clean way of authoring our changes in Visual Studio and getting them up to the server in a very productive way. Let's go ahead and wire this JavaScript up to the form. So let's go to Entities, Forms, and I'll open up the main form here. We'll go ahead and set the form properties. So let's add that JavaScript library to the form. And then let's wire up the function on load. So that's the library. Let's go grab the text from Visual Studio. So we're calling the function in the JavaScript file when the form loads. Click OK, OK. Save and close this. Come back over here. Let's just go ahead and publish. All right, so now if we come over to our form here, so if we refresh this form, with any of the browser debugging tools, we can go ahead and hit F12 here. We can come in, we can find that JavaScript file, hit a breakpoint, refresh again, and we'll hit that breakpoint in the debugger. Now that's great, and if that's how you choose to do it, awesome. I'm a big fan of debugging inside of Visual Studio because that's what I'm used to, and it is, after all, an integrated development environment, and the integrated part of that is that you can do integrated debugging, etc. So in order to use Visual Studio to debug, notice up here that this form itself is actually URL addressable, right? The new form here, we can just grab this URL, come back over to Visual Studio, right-click on the project, select property pages here, and start a URL. So now if I start this from Visual Studio. It's going to ask me if I want to add a web config. That's okay. This doesn't get deployed to Dynamics, but it is what Visual Studio needs to enable debugging. All right, so let's bring this over here. So I'll log in. We'll sign in, stay signed in, and it's going to load that particular page. Now, let me come back over to Visual Studio here. Notice that it's loading a bunch of script documents, and in fact, there is wrdemoform.js. So I can set a breakpoint there and come back over and click refresh. And we hit a breakpoint. And so now I don't have to leave Visual Studio. I don't have to use a different debugging environment for C# code that I use for JavaScript code. I can do all of my debugging right from within Visual Studio using Visual Studio's JavaScript debugger. So I can click continue here, and the form will finish loading. So that's awesome, but I still have to, if I'm writing code here, I have to stop the debugger, I have to go make some changes, I have to deploy to the server. Yeah, and yes, we showed that we can do that easily using the developer extensions here in the web resource deployer. But that's a lot of work. So we can build on all of this using Fiddler. So I happen to have Fiddler running already, but it's not capturing traffic. I'm going to start capturing traffic, and I'm going to walk through two things I have set here. So for filters, I've enabled filters, and then I say show only if URL contains this string, which will narrow the things Fiddler is paying attention to only my web resources. Because if you come over here and you look at the solution and we pull up one of the web resources, you see that string is web resources dkdt underscore right there, right? And so Fiddler is only going to pay attention to those web resources. So I'm narrowing Fiddler down to pay attention to the code that I authored. But you may be saying to yourself, well, that's great, but all Fiddler is going to do for me is show me the HTTP request. When we couple this with Fiddler's autoresponder, this is where things get awesome in my opinion. So I have autoresponder rules enabled, and I've set a regular expression for that same kind of pattern, except this time what this is saying is anytime we see a URL that matches, serve that request locally. All right, that's what this autoresponder does. So I no longer have to go through this make code changes, publish them to the server, test them, make code changes, publish them to the server, test them. Right? I can just make changes locally and test them over and over and over again until they're ready and then publish them to the server. Because basically what Fiddler does in this case, when the browser requests that web resource from the server, it's smart enough to say, okay, I'm going to go pull the local file and serve it to the browser instead of going out to the server. And one thing we have to change here is that the path that we're serving from, because this is from my dry run. So if we go back to Visual Studio here, open in File Explorer, grab that path, go back to Fiddler, and click Save. Now what should happen is when we go to request this, I'll copy that just to prove it. It will be served from this local file, and we can actually test that out. So if I paste this right here, notice it turns green. And I changed the capital W and capital R to lowercase because when model-driven PowerApps using the new unified interface requests these web resources, they're actually lowercase. All right, so let's just kind of prove that out real quick. Let's go back to Visual Studio. One more thing I need to call out. You need to set rules to disable caching, right? Because otherwise, after the browser's loaded this web resource the first time, it's just going to say, hey, I already have it, and load the same web resource until it's changed on the server. And since we're not pushing things up to the server, we need to make sure we disable caching. So let's go back over to Visual Studio here, and I'm just going to make some changes. More updates. We'll save that. Now we'll go back and we'll refresh this page. You'll notice now we hit our breakpoint and this WR demo form got those updates. And so I don't ever have to stop Visual Studio. I can just keep it running, right? So I can come over here and I can say even more updates, save it, refresh this form again. Hit that breakpoint again, continue, come back to Visual Studio. Maybe I found a bug, make some more fixes, yet again, right? Save that file. I remember I'm editing this form down here. Come back over here, refresh again. Hit that breakpoint again, and just over and over and over again. All right, so let's say at this point I got everything right. Now I can come to my developer extensions and select just the one thing that I want to publish. Click publish. And now it's up on the server. And we can just again validate that. So in this video, I showed you how to use Visual Studio and specifically the D365 developer extensions, as well as Fiddler with the filter and autoresponder feature to have a pretty productive web resource development workflow where you can develop locally in Visual Studio, publish to the server when you need to, pull resources down that are already in the server into Visual Studio, debug straight from Visual Studio, as well as make changes to local files without having to stop, make changes, publish, reattach the debugger, stop, make changes, publish. Instead, leave the browser and Visual Studio running, make your changes, and have those local changes served to the browser via Fiddler.